Life has a peculiar way of bringing people together, and for Peter Chen, that moment came on a crisp autumn evening at the Grand City Charity Gala. The chandelier-lit ballroom buzzed with wealthy donors, but his eyes were drawn to an elegant older woman standing alone by the fountain punch bowl, her silver hair styled perfectly and her posture reflecting years of refined grace. As a struggling real estate agent with mounting debts and a tiny apartment he could barely afford, Peter had only managed to attend the gala by volunteering as event staff. He'd spent the evening serving drinks and collecting empty plates, all while watching the city's elite mingle and network. But when he saw Mrs. Eleanor Wu adjusting her diamond necklace with slightly trembling hands, something clicked in his mind. "Would you like some help with that, class?" he offered, stepping forward with his most charming smile. The genuine gratitude in her eyes as she accepted his assistance made him feel a tiny prick of guilt, a feeling he quickly pushed aside. Throughout the evening, Peter kept finding reasons to pass by her table. He learned that she was a widow of 3 years, her late husband having built one of the city's largest import-export businesses. Between serving other guests, he shared carefully crafted stories about his dreams of helping families find their perfect homes, conveniently leaving out the fact that he hadn't closed a deal in months. "You remind me of my Robert when he was younger," Eleanor said warmly, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "He too had such big dreams." Peter nodded sympathetically, while his mind raced with calculations. The diamond necklace alone could probably pay off his credit card debt, and that designer handbag casually placed beside her chair, worth at least 3 months of his rent. Later that night, as Peter scrolled through Eleanor's social media presence, her grandson had apparently insisted she create an account. His plan began taking shape. Photos showed her massive Victorian mansion, her frequent charity donations, and her beloved rose garden. She clearly had wealth beyond his wildest dreams, and more importantly, she seemed lonely. The next morning, Peter called his only successful real estate colleague, borrowing money for a new suit. He got a proper haircut, bought a book about classical music. Eleanor's profile mentioned she was on the symphony board, and even watched tutorials about rose gardening. Each investment was calculated, each detail meticulously planned. What he didn't plan for was running into Eleanor at the local coffee shop just 2 days later. She was struggling with carrying multiple cups for what appeared to be a garden club meeting. Without thinking, he rushed to help, genuinely concerned she might spill hot coffee on herself. The surprise and delight on her face when she recognized him seemed to light up the entire cafe. "Oh, what a wonderful coincidence!" she exclaimed, and Peter found himself invited to join their garden club meeting. Sitting among elderly ladies discussing different types of mulch wasn't exactly his idea of a thrilling morning, but watching Eleanor passionately explain the proper way to prune roses, he saw an opportunity he couldn't miss. That evening, as he added Eleanor's phone number to his contacts, she had insisted on giving it to him. Peter tried to ignore the small voice in his head questioning his actions. After all, wasn't this a win-win situation? She would get companionship, and he would finally escape his financial troubles. Looking at his past due bills spread across his kitchen table, he convinced himself that this was just business, the biggest real estate deal of his life. Little did Peter know that this deal would turn out to be something far more significant than he could ever imagine, and the person he was planning to deceive would end up changing his life in ways he never expected. Over the next 6 months, Peter became a regular fixture in Eleanor's life. Every Wednesday afternoon, he'd arrive at her mansion with a fresh bouquet of flowers, carefully selected to match the ones blooming in her garden. He'd sit patiently for hours, listening to her stories about her late husband and her world travels, all while secretly checking stock prices on his phone under the table. "You have such a wonderful way of listening," Eleanor would say, pouring him another cup of premium jasmine tea that probably cost more than his weekly groceries. Peter would smile and nod, thinking about the antique teapot that must be worth thousands. The hardest part wasn't pretending to enjoy classical music concerts, though sitting through 4-hour operas made him want to pull his hair out. No, the real challenge came during family dinners when Eleanor's children would visit. Her daughter, a sharp-eyed lawyer, would watch him like a hawk, while her son, a business executive, asked probing questions about his failing real estate career. "Mom tells us you haven't sold a house in months," her son mentioned one evening over roast duck. "Must be tough in this economy." Peter wiped his sweaty palms on his pants under the table and smoothly replied that he was focusing on quality over quantity, whatever that meant. But Eleanor always defended him. "He's taking time to find the perfect homes for his clients," she'd say, patting his hand affectionately. Each time she did this, Peter felt a strange twinge in his chest that he tried his best to ignore. The opera nights were the worst. Peter would sit there, fighting to keep his eyes open while Eleanor swayed gently to the music, completely enchanted. He downloaded a classical music appreciation app that taught him just enough to fake intelligent comments during intermission. "The soprano's interpretation of this aria is quite unique," he'd say, having no idea what an aria actually was. One particularly challenging evening involved a Garden Society fundraiser where Peter had to pretend he knew the difference between perennials and annuals. He'd spent the previous night memorizing gardening terms from YouTube videos just to keep up his charade. But when Eleanor proudly introduced him to her gardening friends as someone who truly understands the soul of a garden, he felt like the world's biggest fraud. Yet, there were unexpected moments that caught him off guard. Like when Eleanor showed him her photo albums, and he found himself genuinely interested in the story of how she built her business empire from scratch with her late husband. Or when she taught him how to properly prune a rose bush, and he actually felt proud when the plant bloomed beautifully weeks later. These moments confused him. They weren't part of the plan. He wasn't supposed to actually enjoy learning about the history of Chinese porcelain or feel accomplished when he finally understood the difference between Baroque and classical music periods. This was all meant to be an act, a means to an end. Sometimes, late at night in his cramped apartment, Peter would scroll through his phone, looking at pictures of them together at various events. Eleanor's genuine smile next to his practiced one. Her eyes twinkling with joy as she introduced him to her friends. The proud way she showed him off at charity functions, telling everyone how he was such a dear friend. The guilt would creep in during these moments, but Peter would quickly push it away by reminding himself of his end goal. He'd look at his vision board, where he'd pasted pictures of luxury cars and beachfront properties, all the things that would be his once he and Eleanor were married. But with each passing day, maintaining the facade became both easier and harder. Easier because he was learning to genuinely appreciate some of Eleanor's interests, and harder because that appreciation made him question everything about his plan. Still, he pressed on, telling himself that he'd come too far to back out now. The biggest performance of his life was just beginning, and he couldn't afford to let real feelings get in the way. Peter spent 3 weeks planning the perfect proposal. He chose the Golden Palace, Eleanor's favorite restaurant, where she and her late husband had celebrated their 40th anniversary. The ring, a stunning diamond piece, sat heavily in his pocket, and even more heavily on his conscience. He'd maxed out 2 credit cards to buy it, telling himself it was just another investment in his future. The evening started perfectly. Eleanor wore a beautiful blue silk dress, her silver hair elegantly styled. The maitre d', who knew Eleanor as a regular customer, had given them the best table overlooking the city lights. Peter's hands shook slightly as he ordered her favorite wine, a vintage that cost more than his monthly rent. "You seem nervous tonight, dear," Eleanor said, reaching across the table to pat his hand. "Is everything all right?" Her genuine concern made his rehearsed speech stick in his throat for a moment. Throughout the appetizers, Peter kept touching the ring box in his pocket, reminding himself why he was doing this. The string quartet he'd hired began playing Eleanor's favorite melody, something by Mozart or Bach. He could never remember which. The other diners, all in on the plan thanks to the restaurant manager, watched expectantly. Just as the main course arrived, Peter got down on one knee. The practiced words flowed smoothly. Eleanor, these past months have shown me what true companionship means. He almost believed them himself. You've brought such joy and meaning to my life. That part wasn't entirely a lie. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? The restaurant fell silent. Eleanor's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes glistening with tears. For a terrifying moment, Peter thought she might say no. Then she nodded, whispering yes, as the other diners burst into applause. But the real drama began 20 minutes later, when Eleanor excused herself to call her children with the news. Peter sat there, sipping his wine, feeling victorious. Until he heard raised voices from the restaurant's entrance. Eleanor's son and daughter had arrived, having been nearby at a business dinner. "Mom, you can't be serious." Her daughter's voice carried across the restaurant. "He's younger than I am. This is ridiculous." "Have you lost your mind?" Her son added, "He's clearly after your money." Peter's collar felt tight as he watched Eleanor standing firm against her children's protests. She'd always been stubborn. It was one of the things he'd counted on when planning this. But seeing her defend him, watching her fight with her own children over him, made his stomach churn in an unexpected way. "I know what I'm doing," Eleanor told her children firmly. "I'm not some senile old woman who can't make her own decisions. Peter makes me happy, and that's what matters." The children stormed out, leaving Eleanor to return to the table with tears in her eyes, but her head held high. Peter reached for her hand, performing the role of the supportive fiancé perfectly. Inside, though, his thoughts were a mess. This wasn't supposed to feel so complicated. Later that night, as he drove Eleanor home, she was quietly looking at the ring. "You know," she said softly, "my Robert proposed to me in this same restaurant 45 years ago." Her voice held such love when she spoke of her late husband that Peter felt like the worst person in the world. But then she smiled at him, her face full of trust and hope, and added, "He would have wanted me to be happy again." Peter gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to focus on the road and not on the growing weight in his chest. Back in his apartment that night, Peter stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. The face that looked back at him seemed different somehow. He'd done it. The proposal had worked, the plan was in motion. So why didn't he feel like celebrating? And why couldn't he stop thinking about the hurt in Eleanor's children's eyes, or the complete trust in hers? He fell asleep that night dreaming of bank accounts and mansion keys, but also of tearful family confrontations and Eleanor's unwavering defense of him. The guilt and excitement mixed together into a restless sleep, as the magnitude of what he'd set in motion began to sink in. With just 2 months until the wedding, Peter expected to spend his time reviewing prenuptial agreements and discussing investment strategies. Instead, he found himself being dragged along to soup kitchens and children's hospitals. Eleanor's schedule, it turned out, was packed with volunteer work he'd never known about. "Tuesday mornings are for the homeless shelter," Eleanor explained cheerfully one day, handing him an apron. "I've been serving breakfast here for 15 years. Peter watched in amazement as his elegant fiancée, still wearing her pearl earrings, expertly dished out porridge and chatted with people who had nothing. What struck him most was how everyone knew her name. Not as Mrs. Wu, the wealthy widow, but as Miss Eleanor, who always remembered their stories and asked about their families. A gruff-looking man with weathered hands told Peter, "Your lady there? She helped my daughter get into college. Paid for the whole thing. Never wanted anyone to know about it." At the children's hospital, Eleanor spent hours reading stories to sick kids. Peter stood in the doorway, watching her make different voices for each character, the children giggling despite their IV tubes and monitors. One little girl asked him to join in, and before he knew it, he was doing a surprisingly good impression of a grumpy old bear. "You're a natural," Eleanor beamed at him afterward. "Next week, we'll visit the senior center. They love having young people around." Peter nodded, still thinking about the way the children's faces had lit up during story time. The senior center visit revealed another side of Eleanor he hadn't expected. She taught art classes there, helping shaky hands create watercolor paintings. Art keeps the soul young, she told him, showing him dozens of paintings proudly displayed on the walls. And everyone has a story to tell through their art. One afternoon, while Eleanor was busy organizing a fundraiser for a local school, Peter discovered a drawer full of thank you letters in her study. Curiosity got the better of him, and he began reading. Each letter told a different story. A single mother who could now afford nursing school, a family who kept their home during hard times, a talented teenager who got to attend music camp. Those are my treasures. Eleanor's voice made him jump. He turned to find her watching him with a gentle smile. More precious than any jewelry or painting in this house. Instead of being angry at his snooping, she sat down and began sharing the stories behind each letter. Money is just paper, she said, carefully folding a crayon drawing from a grateful child. But what you do with it, that's what gives it value. Peter felt something shift inside him as he watched her lovingly arrange the letters back in their drawer. Later that week, at a charity auction Eleanor had organized, Peter found himself bidding on items without thinking about their resale value. Instead, he was thinking about the after-school programs they would fund. When he won a painting done by children at the hospital, the pride on Eleanor's face made him forget about the money completely. For a moment, at least. The biggest surprise came when Eleanor took him to visit a small community center in the poorest part of town. The building looked shabby from outside, but inside it was full of life. Children learning computer skills, adults attending ESL classes, seniors getting help with their medications. This is where most of my money goes, Eleanor explained, greeting everyone by name. Robert and I started this place 30 years ago. He always said wealth was like manure, useful only when spread around to help things grow. She chuckled at the memory, while Peter stood there, his carefully laid plans feeling suddenly hollow. That night, alone in his apartment, Peter looked at his vision board again. The sports cars, the yachts, the luxury vacations. For the first time, they seemed empty compared to the real wealth he'd witnessed. The wealth of making a difference in people's lives. He tried to shake off these uncomfortable thoughts, reminding himself of his goals, but Eleanor's words kept echoing in his mind. Money is just paper. The morning of the wedding arrived with golden sunlight streaming through stained glass windows at the Grand Plaza Hotel. Peter stood in his room, adjusting his bow tie for the 100th time, trying to calm his nerves. In just 3 hours, he would be married to one of the wealthiest women in the city. His plan was about to succeed. He'd arrived early to make sure everything was perfect. The flowers, the music, the champagne, all carefully chosen to Eleanor's taste. But as he walked down the hallway to check on the reception area, he heard voices coming from Eleanor's private meeting room. He recognized her voice, along with her lawyer's distinct tone. Peter didn't mean to eavesdrop, but when he heard the words "final arrangement," his feet froze in place. He pressed closer to the partially open door, his heart pounding. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Eleanor?" the lawyer asked. 90% is a substantial portion of your estate." Completely certain. Eleanor's voice was firm. "The foundation will receive most of my wealth. I've always believed in dying with empty pockets and a full heart. Peter and I will keep enough for a comfortable life, but nothing extravagant." Peter's vision blurred. 90%? To charity? He stumbled backward, nearly knocking over a decorative vase. The dreams of mansions and sports cars that had kept him going these past months crumbled like a house of cards. He rushed back to his room, loosening his tie as he struggled to breathe. The walls of the luxurious suite suddenly felt like they were closing in. On his phone, he pulled up pictures of all the things he planned to buy: the beach house in Malibu, the Ferrari, the private yacht. All of it slipping away like sand through his fingers. Sitting on the edge of the bed, he heard Eleanor's laughter floating up from the garden below. She was showing her grandchildren the flower arrangements, her face glowing with joy. The same joy he'd seen when she helped serve meals at the homeless shelter, or when she read stories to sick children. A knock at the door made him jump. It was the wedding planner, asking about last-minute details. Peter answered mechanically, his mind racing. He thought about the past months, all the lies, all the pretense. He'd become an expert at classical music, learned to appreciate fine art, mastered the names of every rose variety in Eleanor's garden. All for nothing. But then another memory surfaced. The pride he'd felt when a homeless man he'd helped got a job, the warmth in his chest when a child at the hospital finally smiled after days of pain, the satisfaction of seeing elderly artists discover their talents in Eleanor's classes. In the mirror, his reflection stared back at him accusingly. The expensive suit felt like a costume now. When had the line between acting and reality started to blur? When had Eleanor's causes started to matter to him? When had her smile become more valuable than her bank account? The wedding march would start playing in less than an hour. Guests were already arriving. He could hear their voices in the courtyard below. Eleanor's children were probably still hoping he wouldn't show up. Maybe they had been right about him all along. His phone buzzed. A text from his real estate broker friend. "Almost there, buddy. You're about to hit the jackpot." The words made his stomach turn. Another message popped up from one of the shelter volunteers. "Can't wait to see Miss Eleanor's happy day. You two are going to do such amazing things together." Peter stood up, his legs shaky. The weight of his decision pressed down on him like a physical thing. Through the window, he could see Eleanor greeting guests, radiant in her cream-colored dress. She looked so happy, so trusting. She had planned to give away her fortune all along, knowing what really mattered in life. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent months pretending to be someone worthy of Eleanor, and now, just when he discovered he might actually be becoming that person, his original plan was falling apart. The next hour would change everything, but not in the way he planned 6 months ago. The wedding march began playing right on schedule. The massive oak doors of the chapel swung open, and Peter watched Eleanor begin her walk down the aisle. She moved with grace, her cream-colored dress flowing behind her. Their eyes met, and her smile, that pure, trusting smile, hit him like a physical blow. Time seemed to slow down. The chapel was packed with faces he'd come to know over the past months. Volunteers from the shelter, children from the hospital, those well enough to attend, elderly artists from her classes, and countless people whose lives she'd touched. They weren't here for the wealthy Mrs. Wu. They were here for Eleanor, the woman who had changed their lives. His hands were trembling as she reached the altar. Up close, he could see the happy tears in her eyes, the slight quiver in her lip that betrayed her emotion. The priest began speaking, but Peter could barely hear the words over the thundering of his own heart. "You look pale, dear," Eleanor whispered, giving his hand a gentle squeeze. That small gesture of concern, even now, she was thinking of others first, made something break inside him. All the carefully constructed walls he built around his conscience came crashing down. He looked at their joined hands. Her skin was soft, marked with age spots and the slight tremor that came with her years. These were hands that had signed countless checks to help strangers, hands that carefully tended roses and wiped away children's tears, hands that had held his own through museums and concerts he pretended to enjoy. The sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows painted rainbow patterns across her face. She was beautiful, not in the way young women were beautiful, but with the kind of beauty that came from a lifetime of kindness. How had he never truly seen it before? The priest's voice penetrated his thoughts. If anyone knows any reason why these two should not be joined in matrimony. Peter's throat went dry. The room felt too warm, too crowded. He could feel Eleanor's children watching him intently from the front row. They had been right about him all along, at least about who he had been when this all started. But now, a memory flashed through his mind. Eleanor teaching the young girl at the shelter how to properly hold a soup ladle. "It's not about the food," she had said. "It's about serving with dignity." Another memory, her quiet pride when one of her elderly art students sold their first painting. Then another, her face lit up with joy when he finally, genuinely appreciated a piece of classical music. The priest continued with the ceremony, but Peter felt like he was underwater. Everything was muffled except for the sound of his own breathing and Eleanor's warm hand in his. She had planned to give away her fortune all along. The very thing he'd been scheming to get his hands on meant nothing to her. He looked out at the sea of faces, not the wealthy society people he'd expected at such a wedding, but mostly humble folks whose lives Eleanor had touched. They were beaming at her, genuinely happy for her happiness. Some were dabbing at their eyes with handkerchiefs. The light caught the diamond ring on Eleanor's finger, the ring he'd bought on credit, thinking it was just another investment in his grand plan. Now it felt like it was burning a hole in his conscience. She deserved so much better than what he had planned to be. The priest asked Eleanor if she would take Peter as her husband. Her "I do" was clear and confident, filled with love and trust. The moment of truth was approaching. In a few seconds, the priest would ask him the same question. Peter's world narrowed to this moment, to Eleanor's warm hand in his, to her trusting smile, to the weight of months of deception on his shoulders. He opened his mouth, but the rehearsed "I do" wouldn't come. Something else entirely was fighting its way out. "I can't do this." The words burst from Peter's lips before the priest could even ask for his vows. A collective gasp rippled through the chapel. Eleanor's hand tightened slightly in his, but she didn't pull away. "I have something to say," Peter continued, his voice shaking but growing stronger with each word. He turned to face the gathered guests, but his eyes stayed locked with Eleanor's. "I came into Eleanor's life with a plan. A terrible, selfish plan." The chapel fell so silent you could hear the rustle of the curtains in the slight breeze. Eleanor's children half rose from their seats, but their mother raised her free hand, gesturing them to wait. "I was a failing real estate agent drowning in debt. When I met Eleanor at that charity gala, His voice cracked, but he forced himself to continue. "I saw her wealth as my ticket to an easy life. I pretended to love everything she loved. I learned about classical music, memorized rose varieties, and attended charity events. All while dreaming about the luxury life I thought I'd have once we were married." Angry murmurs began to rise from the guests. He saw tears forming in Eleanor's eyes, but somehow she was still holding his hand. "But something happened that I never planned for." Peter's voice grew stronger. "I started to change. Not pretend change, but really change. Eleanor, you showed me what true wealth looks like. It's not in bank accounts or fancy cars. It's in the smile of a homeless person getting their first job. It's in the laughter of sick children hearing stories. It's in the pride of elderly artists discovering their talents." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "This morning, I heard you planning to give away 90% of your wealth to charity. 6 months ago, that news would have devastated me. But standing here now, looking at you," he paused, fighting back tears of his own, "it made me realize that I don't want your money anymore. I want to be the person you helped me become." Peter turned to face the shocked audience. "I don't deserve Eleanor's trust or love. I came here thinking I was pulling off the biggest con of my life, but the truth is, I'm the one who was transformed. Eleanor didn't just show me a better way to live. She made me want to be a better person." He unfolded the paper in his hands. "This is a document I had drawn up last night, just in case I found the courage to tell the truth. It's a legal declaration renouncing any claim to Eleanor's wealth, whether she chooses to forgive me or not." The chapel erupted in chaos. Eleanor's children jumped to their feet. Friends and family members began shouting. But through it all, Eleanor remained calm, her eyes fixed on Peter's face. "I know this isn't how wedding ceremonies usually go," Peter said, his voice growing quiet. "And I know I've hurt you deeply. I came here planning to say, I do, and live a lie. Instead, I'm saying, I can't, and finally telling the truth. You deserve so much better than what I planned to be." He gently released Eleanor's hand and stepped back from the altar. "I'll understand if you want to press charges. Everything I own is yours to take, though that's not much." A bitter laugh escaped him. "The only valuable thing I have now is the understanding you gave me about what really matters in life." The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone waited for Eleanor's response. Peter stood there, his heart pounding, ready to accept whatever consequences came his way. For the first time in months, he felt oddly at peace. The weight of deception was gone, replaced by the terrifying lightness of truth. Eleanor slowly walked to the microphone that had been set up for the vows. The chapel remained absolutely silent, waiting for her response. Her children looked ready to call the police, while the wedding guests sat frozen in shock. "I suppose," Eleanor began, her voice steady and clear, "this is as good a time as any to share my own confession." A ripple of surprise went through the room. Peter looked up, confused. "You see," she continued, smoothing her cream-colored dress with trembling hands, "I've known about your initial intentions from the very beginning." Peter's jaw dropped. The guests began murmuring among themselves. "The night we met at the charity gala, I saw how your eyes lingered on my jewelry, how you calculated everything in the room. I've lived long enough to recognize that look." She smiled gently. "But I also saw something else, something you didn't even see in yourself." Eleanor turned to address the shocked audience. "My late husband always said you can tell a person's true character not by their worst moments, but by their capacity to grow beyond them. When Peter started coming to the charity events, I watched him closely. Yes, he was pretending at first, but then something beautiful happened." She gestured toward the hospital children sitting in the front rows. "Remember the first time you read stories to the children, Peter? You thought I didn't notice how you stayed an extra hour when little Tommy was having a rough day after his treatment. You didn't have to do that. It wasn't part of your plan." Peter remembered that day. He'd completely forgotten about it being part of his scheme. He just wanted to make the sick child smile. "And at the homeless shelter," Eleanor continued, "when you spent your own money to buy work shoes for that young man who had a job interview. You thought I didn't know about that either. Or how you've been secretly tutoring some of our senior artists in computer skills so they can sell their work online." Tears were flowing freely down Peter's face now. Each moment she described had felt so natural at the time. He hadn't even realized how much he'd changed. "My children think I'm a foolish old woman who can't see when she's being deceived." Eleanor's voice grew stronger. "But I've spent my life looking for genuine goodness in people, and I saw it growing in you, Peter, day by day. The man who walked into my life planning to deceive me is not the same man who just stood here and chose truth over comfort." She walked over to Peter and took his hand again. The warmth of her touch sent fresh tears down his cheeks. "You had the chance to take everything, to live the lie and gain the wealth you wanted. Instead, you chose to be honest, knowing you would lose everything. That tells me more about your character than all the fancy words in the world." Her children started to protest, but Eleanor raised her hand to silence them. "I've lived a long life, and I've learned that love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone who has the courage to become better. Today, I was supposed to marry a man who was pretending to be good. Instead, I find myself standing beside a man who has actually become good." The chapel remained silent, everyone holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Eleanor reached up and gently wiped a tear from Peter's cheek. "The question now," she said softly, but loud enough for everyone to hear, "is not whether you deserve my forgiveness. You've earned that through your actions and your honesty today. The real question is, now that you've found your true self, what do you want to do with this second chance?" 3 months after the dramatic wedding that never was, Peter sat in his small office at the community center, reviewing grant applications. The room wasn't fancy, just a simple desk, a few chairs, and walls covered with children's artwork. But it felt more like home than any luxury space he'd once dreamed of. The door opened, and Eleanor walked in with 2 cups of tea. "The art class just finished," she said, placing 1 cup on his desk. "Mrs. Chen painted the most beautiful sunset today." Her eyes sparkled with the same enthusiasm she'd always had for her students' achievements. "I'll come see it after I finish reviewing these applications," Peter replied, taking a grateful sip of tea. He traded in his dreams of sports cars for the satisfaction of helping Eleanor manage her charitable foundation. The irony wasn't lost on him. He now spent his days giving away the very money he'd once plotted to take. The wedding might have been called off, but something deeper had grown in its place. Eleanor had suggested they start fresh, taking time to know each other honestly. Their weekly dinners were no longer performances. Peter could freely admit when he didn't enjoy an opera, and Eleanor would laugh, sharing stories of how her late husband had often fallen asleep during performances. The community center had become their shared passion. Peter's real estate knowledge, which he'd once used to chase wealthy clients, now helped them identify buildings for new charitable projects. His sales skills found a better purpose in convincing donors to support their causes. "Your daughter called," Peter mentioned, organizing the grant papers. "She's finally warming up to me, I think. She only questioned my intentions twice during our last meeting." He smiled, remembering how Eleanor's children had gradually begun to accept him after seeing his genuine commitment to their mother's work. Eleanor chuckled. "They're learning, just as you did, that people can surprise you." She paused, looking out the window at the playground they'd recently built. "Speaking of surprises, little Tommy from the hospital is coming home tomorrow. His last treatment was successful." Peter's heart lifted at the news. The little boy who'd once helped change his heart by asking for extra stories was finally healthy. The foundation had covered his medical bills, but more importantly, they'd given his family hope. His old vision board, once filled with luxury cars and mansions, now hung in his office with a different purpose. It showcased photos of completed projects, thank you letters, and future goals for the foundation. The only personal photo was one of him and Eleanor at the shelter's Christmas dinner, both wearing paper crowns and laughing. "Do you ever regret it?" Eleanor asked suddenly, settling into the comfortable chair across from his desk. "The life you could have had?" Peter looked at her thoughtfully. "I was chasing fool's gold," he said. "I wanted wealth, but you showed me what true riches look like. It's in the moments, like when our art students sell their first painting, or when a shelter resident gets their own apartment. That's worth more than any mansion." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the sky outside. Next week, they would break ground on a new shelter. The month after that, they planned to open a job training center. Their calendar was full of projects, dreams, and plans, not for themselves, but for others. "You know," Eleanor said softly, "sometimes the best love stories aren't about romance at all. They're about finding your true self through someone else's eyes." She reached across the desk and squeezed his hand. "You found yours by trying to deceive me, and ended up being honest with yourself instead." Peter squeezed back, thinking about how differently everything had turned out from his original plan. He hadn't gotten the fortune he'd schemed for, but he'd gained something far more valuable: a purpose, a mentor, a true friend, and a chance to make a real difference in the world. As the last rays of sunlight filtered through the window, Peter picked up another grant application. Tomorrow would bring more opportunities to help others, more chances to prove that his transformation was real, and more moments to appreciate the true meaning of wealth, not in dollars, but in the difference you make in others' lives.